It's been dominating headlines for a while now. The South African Revenue Service, or SARS, has confirmed that President Ramaphosa and his companies are tax compliant. This includes officials of his livestock farm in Thaba Nyoni estate and also in Thaba Nyoni feedlot. The president gave the Revenue Service the green light to release his personal tax information. Ramaphosa's financial affairs has been under scrutiny since the controversial Phala Phala farm saga. Let's bring into the conversation SARS Commissioner Mr. Edward Kieswetter joining us this afternoon. Mr. Kieswetter, good afternoon. I appreciate the time. Before we begin to go through what the statement talks about from SARS, I just want to make sure I understand when we are suggesting and we're now SARS confirming tax compliance, that includes or excludes this $580,000 paid for buffalo. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Gareth, and thanks for the opportunity. Let me clarify two things that are connected as part of a similar story that the media reports, but legally separate. The first is that when a traveler comes through our ports of entry and they have a cash amount of higher than 25,000 Rand in any denomination, they have to declare such amount. Should they declare the amount, SARS will retain the amount in excess of $25,000 and will alert the Reserve Bank that it has detained the value of that money. The traveler then has to apply to the Reserve Bank for the release of that money subject to the Reserve Bank requirements. In this regard, we were requested by the Leader of the Opposition whether we could give access to such a declaration. Our response after an extensive search revealed that we do not have such a declaration and that we were therefore not able to provide the Leader of the Opposition with access to such a declaration. Separate from that is the work of SARS, which assesses tax compliance of every individual taxpayer. And in this regard, we appreciate the fact that the President gave us consent, and understandably this is a matter of huge public interest. And I made the statement that it would be great and I encourage other political and civil leaders to similarly reveal for transparency's sake their status. Now, when we assess a taxpayer from the perspective of a business income, we want to make sure that all the transactions that was transacted by that business, all the sales that were transacted, has in fact been declared and that only allowable expenses have been deducted. SARS in itself is indifferent to the form of payment. Whether that payment was in cash or in any other electronic form, SARS looks to the veracity of the information that is disclosed by the taxpayer. And so we look at three things. Firstly, that the outstanding returns are submitted or declared. Secondly, that on the basis of that, whether there's enough information for us to make an assessment of tax liability. And then thirdly, to reconcile the taxpayer account and ensure that the taxpayer is compliant. In this regard, I want to make the following very clear, that SARS's sophisticated case risk and case selection methodology actually selected and has been selecting the taxpayer, specifically the president and his entities. Not only now, we have always been selecting based on our selection criteria. Every taxpayer, there is no preferential treatment for any taxpayer. And so we can say that we have selected these entities based on our risk profiling and case selection ahead of the media breaking the story. That's an important point, and it speaks to the integrity and the impartiality of our case selection process. Secondly, in assessing the returns from these entities, SARS is confident that all income has been declared and the allowable cost has been deducted and that there are no outstanding returns. And therefore, On that basis, we issue a statement that the president in this particular case, the taxpayer, and the two entities are fully compliant.
And I think that's the clarity the country has been looking for. I suppose the question now could be, Mr. Kieswetter, as well, though, if the suggestion is that this individual, this Mr. Mustafa, claims he brought this money in, but there's no record of it from SARS. And I don't want to go into legal with you because I know the police are still looking into those particular issues. I suppose there's now a case of missing money. Mr. Mustafa says he brought the money in. It ended up at Pala Pala, but there's no record of that. And what you're telling me is there's no record of that transaction with either Cyril Ramaphosa or the two entities. That's what you're saying. There's no paper trail here, so there's missing money.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying is there are two separate issues. The one is whether or not an individual brings in money. Secondly, whether or not an individual has declared that money. And in this particular case, if a traveler makes a statement that they have declared it to SARS, they then are at liberty to present the information because SARS would provide them with documentary evidence of a declaration, and the details would be in that. So that has to still come forward. Secondly, we are not saying that we don't follow the money in this regard. The money regulation is between the Reserve Bank. There is Reserve Bank regulation that says any foreign currency brought into the country or received by a business or individual person, that has to be disclosed, it has to have approval, and it has to be converted into local currency within a prescribed period of time. That the Reserve Bank can speak to. Secondly, the FIC also is involved in any what they would consider irregular transit of money. SARS, on the other hand, is indifferent to the form of payment. So when I come to Gareth English, who sells me a good or a service, I can give Gareth, as is the case with any other shop or business person, I can pay for that in terms of my credit card. I can write out a check. For those who still write out checks, I can pay you with cash, or I can do an EFT. SARS would look at whether or not a transaction took place, not necessarily whether that transaction was paid for in cash or in an EFT. We can look through if we need to. What we need to ascertain is whether, in fact, a transaction took place. And we can confirm that a transaction did take place. And it is on that basis that we have made the assessment of the taxpayer's liability and have issued a statement that the taxpayer is compliant. So it is incorrect to say that because there was no declaration by a traveler, that therefore a transaction didn't take place downstream of the value chain. Those are legally two separate issues. Following the money is still the job of the investigating agencies to the extent that they believe that there is money that has gone missing. And secondly, in terms of regulating the money, there are still Reserve Bank requirements and disclosures. And in terms of the Financial Intelligence Center, they would obviously look for any evidence of a suspicious transaction. But as far as we are concerned, we can confirm that the reported transaction did take place. It was fully disclosed and correctly disclosed in the return submitted by the taxpayers, and therefore we are satisfied that the assessment of the liability is correct and the taxpayer is compliant.
And that was the one part of the discussion I wanted to have with you, Mr. Kieswetter, and I think you've explained it very nicely, but I think within all the jargon and all the steps that are taken by SARS, it can get confusing, so I'm glad you clarified that. The second I wanted to get your thoughts on is the comment, and you alluded to it, that there is now a call for more high-profile individuals. Politicians, I imagine, is one of the groups you're talking about, to be more open and transparent. Why make a comment like that? Why make that call?
You know, and this is a personal conviction that I have, Gareth. Our our young democracy is riddled with traces and evidence of corruption, of collusion, often collusion between high-profile government officials and private sector. We have come through an era of state capture. And so, as part of this rebuilding of our country, part of this rebuilding of trust between the state and society, this is not law, right? And SARS cannot enforce such a law. So it is a personal statement that I put out there to say it would be wonderful if more high-profile leaders in society were more transparent about their tax matters, if we want to build trust in the social contract between our leaders and society.
And I don't think many people would argue against more democratic transparency, especially from our leaders. I'll leave you with this last question, Mr. Kieswetter, if you don't mind. How would, I know you're talking about this as a personal view, is there anything within the SARS ambit that could make that a reality? Are there rules or regulations that can be discussed and debated in Parliament, for example, or within SARS that can make that a reality with a certain bracket of high-profile individuals to automatically have their accounts opened up to the public?
I must tell you, I sometimes wish I could do that, because it would take a lot of unnecessary noise out of the system. And SARS is often accused of favoring certain taxpayers, and I can say without any fear of contradiction that we treat every taxpayer the same regardless of their position in society. To your question whether there is a provision, every taxpayer is afforded the same level of confidentiality. We are only able to make the statement about the president's tax matters because he and the public officers that are linked to these entities have given consent. The only other circumstances under which SARS in law is permitted to disclose, to compromise or to disclose, break the confidentiality, is when a taxpayer willfully makes a statement which is factually untrue and brings the revenue agency or SARS into disrepute against what is already a huge effort for us to build public confidence. So I, as the commissioner, am in law permitted to make a disclosure about Gareth. For example, if Gareth goes out and says SARS didn't do ABC, and I believe that it is untrue, you have then, by making an untrue statement, you have given away the right to confidentiality, and I'm able to make a factually correct statement to set the record straight. Otherwise, people would be left to believe an untrue statement or a factually inaccurate statement.
What most people would know is a right of reply, essentially. And I appreciate the time. Commissioner, thank you very much for coming on to eNCA. I think it was two of the big questions the country was waiting to hear, and I appreciate your time. Of course, we are going to follow this up with all the other various bodies as well. As you were saying, you don't necessarily follow the money, but your job as SARS, you are satisfied with how it has come out. SARS Commissioner Edward Kieswetter making time for us this afternoon. Appreciate the SARS Commissioner joining us here on eNCA.